Before I start with today's episode, I want to make an announcement. Next Tuesday is primary day in the state of Florida. If you have not voted, make sure that you vote early before Tuesday or on the day of. If you are voting by mail, make sure to drop it off at your local polling place in your local county or at the post office. If you are planning to vote in person, make sure that you follow the procedures or accessibility requirements if you are disabled at your local polling place location. This midterm election is very important and you do not want to miss it. Poll worker recruitment day has already passed, but if you still want to become a poll worker for this midterm election, it is not too late to sign up and do your civic duty, since we need more poll workers to ensure a healthy democracy. For more information on how to become a poll worker, go to https:/www.eac.gov/help-America-vote. Some of the most important races this year involve school boards, local senators, representatives, governor, and U.S. Senator, and U.S. House of Representatives. They are important for this year's midterm election. And now, on with the show. On today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, my film review is Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, followed by my segment, Allow Me to Explain. And it all starts right now. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. Before we get started on my film review, I want to make a clarification about my previous episode in which I wasn't clear about what is covered in my segment, Allow Me to Explain. The segment is basically a topic of my choice that I feel comfortable with and discussing on my podcast. It's basically random. The topics will vary from hot-button topical issues that are political in nature, just as a word of warning, so I don't want anybody to think that I'm being partisan or anything. Disability, Latino, Latinx advocacy, entertainment news, and animation news. So that's what I was hoping to cover on my segment, Allow Me to Explain. I hope that my clarification was perfectly clear and not vague. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review is Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, released in 1986, from Paramount Pictures and directed by Leonard Nimoy. The film stars the original cast of the Star Trek series, William Shatner as Admiral James T. Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Dr. Bones McCoy, James Doohan as Scotty, George Takei as Sulu, Walter Koenig as Chekhov, and the late Nichelle Nichols, whom we sadly lost this year, as Uhura. So the plot of the film is very simple. An alien probe disrupts the power sources for the Starfleet vessels and command center, as well as causing abnormal weather on planet Earth as it tries to communicate through Earth's oceans, since the alien probe believes that the humpback whales still exist on planet Earth. However, it turns out that the humpback whales have become extinct in the 23rd century. So, Spock decides that the only way that they could try to communicate to the alien probe is to retrieve a humpback whale from the past, Earth's past specifically, and go back to the 23rd century, bring the humpback whale into the 23rd century, communicate to the alien probe, and the alien probe would stop its disruptions. So that's what they do. They end up going back to 1980 San Francisco trying to retrieve the humpback whale, or it turns out 2 humpback whales, and of course, that's where the story begins. So that's just the story of the film, but I will get on to a bit of the casting as well as the direction. Leonard Nimoy, who was not only the actor of the film, but also directed this film, and he had to do double duty for this one, since he had to be enjoying having a joyous time as the director of this film while also playing an emotionally reserved character. I imagine that must be exhausting for him to do double duty for playing 2 roles, the director and the actor. but at least he was able to navigate his way through, and he was able to deliver a film that was released in theaters and on time. He managed to convey both the drama and the humor and make the film as lighthearted as possible without even making it look as if it was bland or mediocre. The rest of the cast is mostly comprised of character actors, and I'll only name a few in the film. So the first of the character actors is Jane Wyatt, who was a classic Hollywood film actress, and she would later become known to television fans as Margaret Anderson on Father Knows Best. So she has a small role in the film as Spock's human mother, Amanda, and this was her last film. She continued on television up until 1992, in which she announced her retirement and died in 2006 at the age of 96. Another television actor who appears in the film in a small role is John Shook as the Klingon ambassador, who has appeared in various television shows from Macmillan and Wife, The Munsters Today, and Law & Order Special Victims Unit. But there is one actor who I thought had the best standout performance in the film. Her name is Catherine Hicks, and she would be better known to horror fans as Karen Barclay in the 1988 film Child's Play, and better known to television fans as Annie Camden in Seventh Heaven. Another actor whom I will mention had a small role in this film is Brock Peters. He plays Admiral Cartwright. He has done everything from To Kill a Mockingbird, Soylent Green, and was the voice of Lucius Fox in Batman the Animated Series. And I'll go on with a little bit of casting trivia. So here's one for you. Did you know that the original actor who was to play the main scientist was reportedly going to be played by Eddie Murphy? It's true. According to IMDb, he was reportedly disappointed by playing the role since he was originally thought he was going to play the role of something like an alien or a Starfleet Enterprise crew member. Another piece of casting trivia was that William Shatner almost didn't make it in the film since he was reticent about rejoining the franchise. But Shatner was offered a pay raise and he was back in the role as James T. Kirk in the film. Story-wise, if you have not seen this film, or if you have watched it but not lately, you will notice that the film does recap the events from the previous film, specifically Star Trek Episode 3 or Star Trek 3. I get Star Wars and Star Trek mixed up, but you get the idea. Anyway, so it recaps the events from the previous film for those who have not seen Star Trek 3. But it only happens in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the film, as well as before Admiral James T. Kirk and the rest of the crew, as well as Spock, who was supposedly reincarnated, end up going back to planet Earth. So that's just the recap of the third film, for those of you who may be confused when watching the opening of the film, like when you're all the way in the film. But as I will mention that I am not a Star Trek fan. I have only remembered seeing the prequels that came out in 2009 as well as 2012, but not the other film that came out in 2016. And I only saw Star Trek: The Motion Picture and Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. So I'm not what you would call a hardcore Star Trek fan, but I'm just an outsider who is just watching it because it's entertainment. But at least if you have not seen this film, I will guarantee you it is not going to be as dramatic as the predecessors, like 1 through 3. It is instead meant to be lighthearted and comedic, and it's basically a popcorn flick. If you have a friend or someone who likes watching these types of films that are enjoyable or funny, this film may be for you. If not, then, it's not that hard to just say you don't have to watch it. So the film was released theatrically. The film was released on November 26, 1986, and it went on to receive mostly positive reviews from critics and fans alike. Most of the praise went to the story, the acting, the humor, the directions, as well as the special effects. The effects, while it may look antiquated from a contemporary perspective, it feels like a time capsule of what visual effects look like before computer-generated effects would take over. So what you would see in the film is basically models, practical effects, matte background paintings, as well as using a huge water tank, which is still usable today. but it had the honor of being nominated for 14 Saturn Awards, including Best Actor for Nimoy and Shatner, as well as 4 Oscars at the 1987 Academy Awards. And even more interestingly, this is still back on the theatrical perspective, it was the first Star Trek film to actually be shown in the Soviet Union before it was dissolved, and was screened at the World Wildlife Federation to celebrate the ban on whale hunting or whaling. Overall, I would say that the film, it is an enjoyable film. It's a popcorn flick. It is a film that, although I may not like the pandering on whaling, even though it's meant to be repeated all throughout the film and the extinction of humpback whales in this film, it's an enjoyable film. It's really something that I would like to address. Oh, and one more thing that I have forgot to mention. In the beginning of the film, the actual beginning, there is a special dedication to the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger who died that year. And there is a dedication to those who sadly passed away before the film opened in 1986. But it's also a great time capsule for those who are not familiar with what San Francisco was like in the 1980s. You would see a lot of the hair, the clothing, the cars, what people were doing back then. And also because it was meant to be shot entirely on location. It was the first Star Trek film / part of the franchise to do so outside of Los Angeles or San Diego. So, that is my film review for today. And we will be right back with Allow Me to Explain my next segment. With the recent rise of mergers and acquisitions in the media industry, it is time to wonder if now is the time to bring the issue into the mainstream, since it is rarely talked about. It's time for Allow Me to Explain. When someone hears the term mergers and acquisitions, one would think of the combination of 2 companies as one. Well, that's somewhat true, but it's not quite true at all. A merger does mean having 2 companies as one entity, like Warner Discovery if you kept up with the latest news, while an acquisition is when one company takes control of another company with money as an exchange. In other words, mergers are meant to be on a friendly basis when it comes to the scale and scope of the company for economic reasons, while an acquisition is tended to be more hostile and rough. So when one would ask if there is only just one type of merger or acquisition in the world of business, the answer to that question is simply no. There are 4 different types of mergers and acquisitions in the business world: horizontal, vertical, conglomerate, and concentric. So I'll try my best to explain the differences and the definitions between these 4 different types of M&As. A horizontal merger acquisition is when 2 companies operate in the same market selling similar products. One example of this is the Facebook and Instagram deal back in 2012, when Facebook bought Instagram for its acquisition for a reported $1 billion according to Investopedia.com, and since that historic integration, Instagram's estimated value according to Bloomberg's intelligence report was $100 billion. A vertical merger acquisition or integration is when 2 companies operate at different stages of the supply chain, or to make it simple, it is the combination of 2 or more companies that are now integrated, involved in production of goods and services. A good example of this would be Pixar and Disney back in 2006. The Walt Disney Company back then decided to buy Pixar that was worth over $7 billion as part of the deal, according to CorporateFinanceInstitute.com. A conglomerate merger / acquisition is when 2 companies from different industries join together. An example of this practice is when Amazon bought Whole Foods in 2017 for $13.4 billion. Amazon is known as being part of the e-commerce industry, while Whole Foods is an American food retailer market that sells food. A concentric merger acquisition is when 2 companies operate in the same industry and have the same customer or demographic group, but they offer different products. An example of this practice is the merger of Heinz and Kraft back in 2015 for a deal of $100 billion according to Dealroom.net. So, one would ask, why would I talk about this important and somewhat highly topical subject matter? Well, it's pretty simple. Recently, as I have mentioned in the intro of this show, we have seen a recent rise in mergers and acquisitions in almost every industry that is actually limiting the amount of competition, resulting in layoffs, raising prices of products or services, and when a company goes too big, it will not be able to handle the control of the big company. So specifically, I am talking about the media industry itself, if you have not kept up with the latest news that I have mentioned. Even after the FTC, headed by Lina Khan, had this year made it a priority to update the merger guidelines to prevent any upcoming mergers and acquisitions as a draft, before finalization, the agency seems to have their hands tied with mounting lawsuits and a lack of enforcement to force the big companies from becoming too monopolistic. And some of the mergers that are supposed to provide the good for the consumer due to these mergers and acquisitions have done the exact opposite. Some of the examples range from Facebook's inability to control misinformation online, to the meat industry causing abuse to ranchers, or how big pharma companies increased prices for insulin. According to the Washington Post, the idea was that merged corporations would pass savings from firing workers onto consumers in the form of lower prices, but the reality and the debunking of this concept is that it would increase the prices for consumers rather than lowering it. And also, according to the Washington Post, as it described the reality of the merger between AT&T and Time Warner back in 2018, quote, AT&T's acquisition of Time Warner netted Time Warner's CEO a $400 million parachute, while a staggering 45,000 workers were cut from payrolls and consumers saw a steady stream of price hikes on streaming and satellite TV services after the merger cleared. To help illustrate the example of the damage that mergers and acquisitions can do to the entertainment industry, here is an excerpt that is 5 minutes long of Adam Conover discussing the issue with the FTC and the DOJ back in April of this year, when he was asked to provide his own testimony about the damage that mergers and acquisitions have done to him when he hosted Adam Ruins Everything after the merger between Time Warner and AT&T.
I'm here in part because the show I created, Adam Ruins Everything, was killed by a corporate merger, specifically by AT&T's acquisition of Time Warner. Waves of merger in this industry, approved by regulators or the courts, have put a handful of companies in control of what stories writers are allowed to tell and what viewers are allowed to watch, and done tremendous harm to the everyday workers whose labor powers the entertainment industry. In 2015, I created an investigative comedy show for the cable network truTV. It ran for 3 seasons and 65 episodes. It was the second biggest show on the network and was described as a breakout hit by the network president. But in 2018, AT&T acquired Time Warner, truTV's parent company. And then, as so often happens after mergers, AT&T announced a major reorganization. Now, we all know that that's boss code for layoffs, but this time it was code for basically shut down the entire network. Roughly 100 truTV employees were fired, including the head of the network and the entire programming department, and AT&T then started canceling shows to cut costs. A month after our season finale aired, I got a call from the new boss at AT&T saying that they were canceling the show despite its success. And today, what was once a thriving TV network that employed thousands of artists now airs archival reruns of a single reality show over and over again. 3 years after that merger turned out to be a financial disaster, Warner Media merged again, this time with Discovery. And just yesterday, 2 weeks after that merger closed, that new entity announced that they were ending all scripted television production at TNT and TBS, 2 networks that have been leading the way in cable scripted programming for over 30 years. I received texts all day from friends whose shows had suddenly been canceled in the middle of shooting. Now, why would a healthy television network with hit shows watched in millions of households voluntarily commit suicide? Well, the executives of the new megacorp proudly state in the press that the only reason these cuts were made was the merger. Now, in decades past, when a show was canceled, the writer in the studio could take it to another network. And that's because until recently, the networks that broadcast the content competed to buy content from the studios, and the studios in turn competed for the services of writers, directors, and other artists, all to bring the best ideas to the public. But after 2 years of vertical and horizontal mergers, today, the network that broadcasts your show also owns the studio that makes it, the IP that it's based on, and the cable infrastructure that brings it to your house. Just 6 excuse me, just 6 companies now control the production and distribution of almost all entertainment content available to the American public in theaters, on TV, and on streaming services. And the impact on those of us who actually make all this content has been profound. When I created Adam Ruins Everything in 2015, we pitched it to truTV, TNT, TBS, Discovery, and HBO. But today, all those buyers have consolidated into a single entity, HBO Max. With fewer employers competing for our labor, they can more easily hold down our wages and set onerous terms for our employment. For example, despite unprecedented growth and record profits, my union has found that median pay for TV writer-producers is nearly the same as it was in the 90s, 30 years ago. And this problem affects every worker in our industry. Because the companies unilaterally control the schedules of so many movies and shows, crew members are now being forced to work longer and longer hours, sometimes working 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, for months on end for very low wages. Actors find themselves trapped in exclusive contracts that prevent them from pursuing other work, even when they're not shooting. And after Disney merged with Fox, they used their market power to end back-end participation, preventing show creators and producers from sharing in the profits of the work they created. Now, the corporate lawyers will say that all of this, the layoffs, the cuts to worker pay, are good because they reduce prices for consumers. But if there's a single example of one of these media mergers reducing prices in any way, I would love to see it. In fact, a recent report by the Writers Guild lays out the truth that every media viewer already knows. Today, we pay more than ever for less choices. Finally, the economic power wielded by this tiny group of companies means that they control what we as creators are allowed to say and what messages the public has access to. My show was well known for telling the uncomfortable truth about difficult subjects, but the only time we were censored by our network was when we did an episode called Adam Ruins the Internet about monopolistic consolidation in the cable industry. And after it aired, Time Warner pulled the episode from reruns and streaming because they were worried it would anger AT&T and jeopardize the merger. And I know that my story is not the only one. Without competition, these companies have no incentive to take a chance on new stories from emerging creators. Instead, they pack their services with cheap, repetitive content based on IP they already own because there's nowhere else to go. So, I know I'm getting the light, so I'll wrap it up. My earnest plea is that the next time our governmental agencies review a merger, they ask the question, whose voices will this merger silence? Which ideas will never reach our ears? Whose stories will the public never get to see? It's long past time to recognize the harm that mergers like these do to workers, to creators, and to the viewing public. Our media ecosystem and the workers who make their living within it must have fair competition to survive.
So the question now remains, what can we do about it? Well, as of right now, since the Senate is on recess due to the midterm elections, and there is very little time to get important bills related to antitrust within the DOJ and the FTC to get things done due to the winding narrow gap of time, the only thing we can do is to call your senators and your representatives and let them know that you would want to see Congress pass meaningful legislation that would protect against the onslaught of the rise of mergers and acquisitions. To get more information on how to organize, strategize, and be creative about how to contact your senators and representatives on this issue, go to EFF.org, freepress.org, fightforthefuture.org, and other organizational nonprofit websites to help get the word out, to get Congress to pass these important pieces of legislation, such as the Prohibiting Anti-Competitive Mergers Act from both the House and the Senate, as well as the Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Act of 2021, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, and the Open Apps Market Act, to make sure these get passed before the midterms this November. It is a must and not an option. If these bills are not passed due to inaction or lack of motivation, then the trend will continue until the last remaining company or conglomerate stands. This has been Allow Me to Explain. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor and Spotify every Friday, and is also available to listen to on my blog website, filmtalkwithjordanramirez.wordpress.com, with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on letterboxd.com. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.